Introduction: The Untold Code of Crusader Survival. In every history book, the Crusaders are shown as armored warriors of faith, fearless knights marching under the cross, their swords flashing in the sun, their banners fluttering above the sands of Jerusalem. But this romantic image is only the surface. Beneath it lies a raw, brutal, and often terrifying reality, that survival, not glory, was the Crusaders' true battle. Imagine this: you're a knight from France, barely 20 years old. You've sworn an oath to liberate the Holy Land. You've left your family, your land, and the only life you've ever known. You've traveled through unfamiliar lands for months, even years, facing not only enemy blades but plague, starvation, betrayal, and the wrath of nature itself. The sun scorches your armor by day. The cold bites into your flesh by night. Food runs out. Water is a memory. Brothers in arms die beside you, not in glorious battle, but in silence from infection, despair, or poisoned wells. And yet you march on. How did thousands of knights, pilgrims, and commoners manage to survive in such merciless conditions? What kept them going when everything seemed lost, when hope turned to hunger, and zeal turned into ritualized desperation? This was no simple military campaign. The Crusades were a total survival test, physical, mental, and spiritual. Crusaders had to develop an entirely new way of life far from the comforts of Europe. They became masters of adaptation. They combined ancient Roman techniques, mystical, religious rites, local knowledge, and sheer brutality into an evolving code of survival. Prepare to enter a world where the sacred and the savage coexisted, where divine purpose clashed with raw instinct, where survival meant praying to God, while sharpening your blade and counting your breadcrumbs, because in the Middle Ages, to survive the Crusades was not a miracle. It was a skill set. 1. The art of food preservation and rationing in Crusader camps. A knight may die by the sword, but he starves by the spoon. This old Crusader proverb captures the stark truth of medieval warfare. No battle was more enduring or more unforgiving than the silent war against hunger. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, tens of thousands answered the call. But few of them realized that their greatest challenge would not be defeating the Saracens, but finding their next meal. The long journey across Europe and into the Holy Land would take months, sometimes years, and reliable food sources were almost non-existent. Armies could not forage forever. Supply chains broke down, cities refused entry. Famine, not arrows, often killed the most. Salt, the holy mineral of survival. Salt was the Crusaders' most valuable commodity after their weapons. It was not only used to flavor food, it was essential for preserving meat during the long, hot marches through arid lands. Knights would slaughter animals and rub the meat with thick layers of salt, pressing it into leather pouches or wooden barrels. These would be stored underground or in shaded wagons. Salted pork, lamb, or even horse meat became survival staples. Templar knights had designated salt stewards who managed stocks like a modern-day logistics officer. Losing salt meant losing food. Some even risked ambushes just to reach coastal towns or salt mines. Hardtack, the indestructible bread, known as bisque in Crusader camps. Hardtack was a kind of stone-hard biscuit made from just flour and water, baked over and over until all moisture was gone. These biscuits could last years without spoiling. Crusaders would soak them in wine, broth, or even spit to soften them. Some desperate soldiers used rocks or sword hilts to break them open. During famines, hardtack became a lifeline. Monks accompanying Crusader armies blessed these biscuits before marches, believing they carried divine endurance. Underground granaries and holy hiding. In cities like Antioch and Acre, the Crusaders built secret granaries under monasteries and churches. These underground vaults remained cool year-round and were often hidden behind altars or in crypts. Why under religious sites? Because no enemy would dare desecrate them, and no Crusader would dare steal from them. Food became sacred. Theft from a granary was punished not just with death, but with excommunication. Some granaries were protected with coded locks, taught only to a small circle of clerics and officers. The water crisis, inventing liquid lifelines. Water was far more dangerous than food. Wells were often poisoned by retreating enemies. Lakes could be disease-ridden. So Crusaders got creative. Camel bladders were dried and reused as water skins. Vinegar water posca was used to kill bacteria in suspect sources. Some Templar camps trained soldiers to dig for underground springs, a skill learned from Byzantine engineers. Knights' Hospital or organized oasis routes. setting up tiny safe zones every 50 to 70 kilometers. These stops provided minimal food, water, and first aid. Religious fasting as a survival tool. Many Crusader commanders used fasting, officially for spiritual reasons, unofficially to conserve supplies. Entire armies were ordered to fast on Fridays, not out of holiness but desperation. Sometimes, fasts were extended for weeks. The Church approved these under the concept of penance in pursuit of redemption. Meanwhile, rations quietly lasted longer. Monks kept food logs in coded Latin, disguising inventories as hymns or psalms. Example: Panis noster, dibus decem, carnis reliquii, tescio nocti, our bread lasts 10 days. The meat remains until the third night. Meal rituals and the power of routine. Mealtime in Crusader camps wasn't chaotic. It was ritualized. The Templars, especially, treated meals as spiritual events. All knights ate in silence. No food was wasted. No second servings. Rations were divided by rank and duty. Higher officers ate last, not first, to set an example. Anyone caught hoarding or stealing was punished harshly. Meal hours became the only consistent part of Crusader life, offering mental stability in a chaotic world. The dark secret: cannibalism at Mara. The siege of Mara in 1098 was one of the darkest moments of the First Crusade. After weeks of starvation, multiple sources, both Christian and Muslim, report that some Crusaders ate the bodies of the dead. This horror was later removed or softened by church historians, but remains a historical fact. It showed how survival could eclipse morality. Location and structure. Hospital or field hospitals were usually set up near command centers, often within fortified monasteries. These hospitals had stone floors easier to clean blood and waste, separated wards, and even designated spaces for the dying. Patient triage. They used a form of triage, admitting nobles first, followed by injured knights, and then lower-ranking soldiers. Infectious patients were isolated. Cleanliness. Linen cloths were washed often with vinegar, and tools were occasionally boiled, not out of germ knowledge, but for ritual or odor control. Surgical procedures. Amputation, trepanation, and cauterization. The most common procedures included amputation due to infected or shattered limbs, usually performed with a bone saw. A stick or leather was given to bite, and assistants restrained the patient. Bleeding was stopped by cauterization, pressing a red-hot iron to the stump. Herbal coagulants, such as crushed yarrow or dried nettle powder. Trepanation, a dangerous practice involving drilling or scraping into the skull to release pressure or bad humors, usually used for head trauma after battle. Wound stitching, done using animal sinew, horsehair, or linen thread. Needles were thick and crude, and no numbing agent was used. Arrow extraction, special tongs and arrow spoons were developed to extract deep projectiles without widening the wound. Medicines and treatments, the apothecary approach. The Crusaders relied heavily on herbal remedies, many of which were adopted from Arab, Byzantine, and Jewish medical traditions. Common herbal applications. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, a natural painkiller similar to aspirin. Garlic and honey, used for their antibacterial properties. Honey was packed into wounds to prevent infection. Wine and vinegar, used for wound irrigation. Mandrake root, occasionally used as a sedative or mild anesthetic, though dangerous in high doses. Exotic additions. Crusaders brought home Eastern remedies, including opium extracts, myrrh and frankincense, used to calm or purify camphor and alumphora infections and skin diseases. For plague, infection, and isolation techniques. Diseases like dysentery, leprosy, and even early forms of plague swept through Crusader camps. Waste management. Latrines were dug outside the walls, and orders were issued not to defecate near sleeping quarters or wells. Quarantine. Some Crusader cities, for example Acre, developed primitive quarantine zones, especially during outbreaks. Leper houses. Orders, such as the Order of St. Lazarus, were specifically created to care for lepers. 5. Mental health and spiritual healing. The Church viewed mental disturbances as a sign of sin or demonic possession. But Crusader orders recognized the toll of war. Confession and Mass were required before and after surgery to purify the soul. Monks and chaplains accompanied surgeons and often whispered prayers during operations. Holy relics. Templars carried fragments of saints' bones or crucifix pieces, which they believed warded off infection or aided recovery. 6. Women and medical support. Though largely excluded from combat, women, especially nuns, played a significant role in medical support, prepared bandages and herbal salves, tended to wounded behind the lines. In some cases, performed minor procedures or organized field clinics. 7. Medical manuals and knowledge transfer. During the Crusades, cross-cultural medical exchange reached new levels. Crusaders translated Arabic medical texts, for example Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, into Latin. Templar libraries contained texts on Greek, Roman, and Muslim medicine, which were copied and spread throughout Europe. Surgical instruments found in Crusader camps show a blend of Western and Eastern design. 8. Survival rates and historical outcomes. Survival post-amputation, 25 to 30% in best conditions. Arrow wound recovery, 50 to 60%. Depending on location, infection mortality, as high as 70% in camps during sieges. And yet, the survival improved over time. By the 13th century, some Crusader medical practices were more advanced than those in parts of Europe. Battlefield medicine during the Crusades was brutal, unsanitary, and frightening, but it was also surprisingly systematic. While pain was inevitable, the Crusaders developed layered methods of emergency care, infection control, and spiritual healing that saved countless lives. Their willingness to learn from the cultures around them, from Arab medics to Jewish apothecaries, marked a rare moment of cooperation amid chaos. 3. Psychological warfare and superstition in the Crusades. How faith, fear, and symbols protected the Crusaders. In a world ruled by swords and religion, where the line between salvation and damnation seemed as thin as a blade's edge, psychological strength was as vital to survival as armor or food. For the Crusaders, survival did not depend solely on military tactics or logistical skill. It also depended on a set of deeply rooted beliefs, rituals, and symbols that shaped how they interpreted suffering, danger, and death itself. In the absence of modern psychology or mental health care, Crusaders turned to faith and superstition as frameworks through which they could process fear, exhaustion, trauma, and isolation. Whether consciously or not, their mental resilience was built upon a symbolic system that offered order in chaos, divine explanation in defeat, and courage in despair. Among the most critical elements of Crusader psychology was the conviction that their cause was wholly not just politically justified but divinely ordained. This belief was not simply motivational, it provided a powerful cognitive defense against fear and guilt. A Crusader who believed he was acting under divine command could endure extreme hardship, inflict violence, and accept death with a sense of purpose. The religious framing of suffering as redemptive, even glorious, allowed soldiers to reinterpret wounds, disease, or the deaths of comrades as acts of sacrifice in the name of God, not meaningless losses. This worldview was reinforced by constant exposure to symbolism and ritual. The red cross sewn onto their tunics, for instance, served as both an identifier and a psychological shield. Before major battles or sieges, Crusader commanders often orchestrated elaborate religious ceremonies, processions with relics, collective prayers, fasts, or confessions, designed to unify troops and sanctify their cause. These rituals had multiple psychological effects. They reduced individual fear by transforming it into a shared experience. They created emotional momentum, and they strengthened discipline by embedding behavior within a sacred context. Some crusading orders, especially the Knights Templar, practiced strict routines of silence, prayer, and meditation that function much like cognitive behavioral techniques. Through daily repetition, these rituals conditioned members to maintain emotional control, accept suffering without question, and suppress panic. Interestingly, the enemy's own belief system was also a factor in Crusader mental resilience. Facing a Muslim opponent who was equally devout and disciplined created a mirror effect. It intensified the Crusader's need to affirm the righteousness of his own path. Muslim tactics such as releasing horses with Quranic verses tied to their manes or launching arrows wrapped in scriptures were seen as both blasphemous and psychologically threatening. Moreover, fear-based myths and stories were propagated deliberately within Crusader camps. Tales of invincible Christian martyrs or angels aiding in battle circulated frequently, often invented or exaggerated after victories. These legends were tools to shape morale, especially among younger or less experienced troops. The belief that saints or archangels could intervene on the battlefield made the impossible seem achievable. Psychological tactics extended even to camp design and leadership structure. Commanders placed crosses at the center of camps, organized sleeping quarters by rank and spiritual readiness, and posted priests near latrines and hospitals. Every action, no matter how mundane, was touched by spiritual logic, and therefore took on psychological significance. A crusader didn't just eat or sleep, he prepared his soul, reinforcing his resilience through symbolic repetition. In the end, the crusaders' psychological survival system was neither accidental nor primitive. It was a comprehensive framework of belief, ritual, symbol, and shared myth. It allowed men to endure starvation, face hopeless odds, bury friends, and still march forward. Even in defeat, they interpreted suffering as part of a divine plan, a form of mental alchemy that transformed despair into duty. Without this system, it's likely that many crusader armies would have dissolved from within, long before reaching their targets. It wasn't just the sword or shield that sustained them, it was the invisible armor of belief. The Crusaders' code, survival beyond the sword. Despite the violence and chaos that defined the Crusades, not all survival came from brute force. In fact, the most effective Crusaders knew something deeper, something that whispered beneath the clashing steel and religious zeal, the Crusaders' code. This unwritten code was a blend of psychological discipline, secret knowledge, and unbreakable routines that helped knights and soldiers live through years of brutal campaigns. These warriors followed daily rituals not just for combat readiness, but for mental resilience. Before battle, they often prayed in solitude, fasted, or meditated in silence, not just to cleanse their soul, but to tame fear. Commanders chose fighters not only for skill but for their mental durability. Panic and impulsiveness were death sentences in the Holy Land. They rotated shifts guarding the camp, assigning scouts to higher ground while others patrolled the surrounding forest. They avoided water at dawn or dusk, knowing ambushes were likely in those quiet transitions. Fires were kept small and dug low to avoid detection. Horses were fed last not out of cruelty, but because if a man could not ride, the horse was useless. In enemy territory, knowledge was power. Some carried coded maps, inscriptions hidden within prayer books or embroidered into cloaks. Trusted monks and scribes created invisible ink texts that revealed local water sources, safe paths, or trap-laden terrain. A single misplaced parchment could mean annihilation for an entire regiment.